Hello, and welcome to what may become a regular feature or may not. Footage, photos, even basic information are a bit tougher to come by once you step outside the top divisions, but here's a quick tour around some of the Formula 3 and Formula 3000 level competitions from around the world. And unlike my usual F1 videos, I am going to be working from a modern perspective on these ones and pointing out the drivers who will go on to be notable. So, let's start in Germany. The 1989 German Formula 3 Championship was primarily dominated by domestic drivers and teams, with a Swiss contingent, presumably thanks to that country's ban on motorsport. Racing took place at established circuits like Hockenheimring and the Nürburgring, with 2 rounds outside Germany, one at the Masaryk Ring near Brno in Czechoslovakia, and at the Österreich Ring. The title was incredibly close, with Austrian Karl Wendlinger, the sole entry for former racing driver Helmut Marko's team, taking the title by just 1 point, with Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Michael Schumacher, driving for Willy Weber's youth development team, tying on points for second place, separated by Frentzen's 3 wins to Schumacher's 2. In fourth, also with 3 wins, was Michael Bartels, driving for the rather wonderfully named Bongers Motorsport. Peter Zakowski, son of Erich, brought a smile to the Zakspeed owners' otherwise terrible season, with a win on his way to 6th overall, just ahead of future DTM star Ellen Lohr, who as far as I know remains the only woman to have ever won a DTM race. Further down the table you'll see other drivers who went on to successful careers in other formulae such as Frank Biela, Marco Werner, Michael Krum, and, in a bit of a left turn, Swiss driver Daniel Müller, who won Olympic gold for curling at Nagoya in 1998. British Formula 3 was always more of an international affair, thanks to the proliferation of UK-based Formula 1 teams. Young drivers wanting to get noticed tended to gravitate to the British scene. The 1989 British F3 season was largely a 2-horse race between Australian David Brabham, youngest son of Sir Jack, driving for sophomore outfit Bowman Racing, and Alan McNish of the established West Surrey racing outfit, former employers of Ayrton Senna, Jonathan Palmer and Mauricio Gugelmin. In a rather distant third was Irish driver Derek Higgins, who would go on to success in Mexican F3 and then Indy Lights. Brabham, McNish and Higgins divided up most of the wins between them, but Swede Ricard Riddell won the opening race at Thruxton and took 2 poles, while Jackie Stewart's son Paul, driving his own team's car, won a shortened race at Snetterton. And at Brands Hatch, another Bowman driver, Belgian Philippe Adams, won from pole. Other drivers turning heads in the series included Finn Mika Hakkinen, taking 2 poles and 2 fastest laps in his first season, and his compatriot Mika Salo, who struggled with uncompetitive equipment for Alan Docking Racing, who were also in their first season in F3, as well as Swiss driver Alain Menu. And in the lower reaches of the table was Derek Warwick's younger brother Paul, who had driven for Eddie Jordan the previous season. Jean-Marc Gounon dominated the French series for the Oreca team, finishing with 121 points and 5 wins to second-placed Laurent Dome's 68 points and 2 wins for Altos. Future touring car star Ivan Muller finished the season 4th, 1993 Le Mans winner Eric Ellery was 5th, as Gounon's Oreca teammate, despite winning 3 races, with Ludovic Foret for Écurie Elf and German Michael Bartels for Bongers Motorsport the other race winners. Things were closer in Italy, with Gianni Morbidelli for the Forti Corsi team taking the series with 50 points and 6 wins out of 11, with Antonio Tamburini of the Prema Racing team second with 47 points after winning the first 2 races and then the penultimate around at Imola, while Eugenio Visco of EC Motorsport and Andrea Montemini of Euro team picked up a win each and finished 3rd and 4th respectively in the standings. There were other drivers coming through too, with Alessandro Zanardi taking 2 poles and 3 podiums, but finding his car down on power due to their switching to unleaded fuel, and ultimately winding up 7th. Like German F3, Japanese F3000 was primarily a domestic affair, with Hitoshi Ogawa taking the title despite only winning 1 race, while Eddie Cheever's younger brother Ross took 2nd for the Dome team, winning twice, coming 2nd twice, and failing to score in every other race. 1/5 and a win for Honda test driver Emanuele Pirro was enough for 6th in the table before he went off to compete in F1. Other foreign drivers in the championship included Paula Barilla, who had won Le Mans in 1985 and was looking for a way into single-seaters, American Jeff Krosnoff, who would go on to IndyCar and be tragically killed at the wheel in 1996, British veteran Jeff Lees, and F1-bound Italians Fabrizio Barbazza and Marco Apicella. The inaugural British Formula 3000 Championship was regarded as a feeder series to International F3000 and was contested over 9 rounds. The series was won by the older son of Jack Brabham and convicted child sex offender Gary Brabham, with British driver Andrew Gilbert Scott, a descendant of the architects Giles and George Gilbert Scott, on his father's side, while his mother's side owned Morgan. Andrew Gilbert Scott would go on to race in Japanese F3000 for many years and become quite well known there. In third place was Austrian Roland Ratzenberger, who'd been competing in Britain for several years, and in 1985 had appeared alongside near namesake Roland Rat in an item for breakfast television. Another son of a Formula champion, Damon Hill, made a couple of appearances but was struggling for sponsorship, as was future Stig Perry McCarthy, who came second in the only race he contested. And so on to the big time, International Formula 3000, a 10-round championship taking place exclusively in Europe as it happened, and one with considerable trouble going on behind the scenes as costs were spiralling, and a series of interesting decisions that meant that by July, the results of 2 of the 4 races run were still subject to appeals and protests. There was, as ever, much driver swapping due to sponsorship deals, and the FIA had instituted a rule that only one driver swap was allowed per car, though this in itself caused problems with definitions when Ross Hockenhull and Alain Ferté arranged to share a seat with Cobra Motorsports, only for the stewards at Jerez to object to Ross coming back to the seat after a 2-race stint for Ferté. The FIA had said it would be fine, the Spanish stewards insisted it constituted a second driver change. Anyway, the season started with the Silverstone International Trophy, with Swiss driver Philippe Favre taking pole and fastest lap for GA Motorsport, but Swede Thomas Danielsson took the win for Madgwick Motorsport, their first, and a great comeback for Danielsson after missing 1988 after an eye operation. Favre came in second, with Marc Blundell third for Middlebridge Racing. French duo Jean Alesi and Eric Comar were fourth and fifth, with Belgian Eric van der Poel picking up the final point. Finnish driver JJ Leto, last year's F3 champion, making the step up along with his successful Pacific team, should have been third, but was disqualified for a technical infringement. Next up was Vallelunga, where Martin Donnelly took pole and dominated in the Eddie Jordan car, only to be disqualified after another team protested his nose cone, which had been replaced but not individually crash-tested. Instead, the First Racing team, who had failed to make the F1 grid in 1989, took the win, with Fabrizio Giovanardi, later to become the most successful touring car driver ever with 10 titles, and Italian-Swiss driver Andrea Chiesa second for Roni Motorsport. Van der Poel, driving for a second GA Motorsports team using Lola Fords rather than the March Judds used by Philippe Favre, was third, Eric Comas fourth for Dams, Chiesa's teammate Emanuele Naspetti fifth, and Alain Ferté sixth in the Cobra. Marco Apicella, also driving for first but in a different chassis to Giovanardi, took pole in Po, but Eric Bernard in second was slightly slow off the mark, kicking off an enormous pile-up that took out all but 5 of the field. Bernard led from the restart until the marshals messed up, getting him stuck behind some stranded cars, then he stormed back through to third before tripping over Blundell. Jean Alesi came through to win, with Apicella second and Danielsson third, with JJ Leto finally getting his and Pacific's first points in F3000 in fourth. Alain Ferté was fifth and Marc Blundell eventually sixth. Next up was Jerez, where Bernard dominated the meeting, taking the Grand Slam of pole, fastest lap and a win, with his Dams teammate coming in second and Marco Apicella third. Van der Poel, Alesi and Leto made up the point scorers, which put Jean to the top of the standings. The Mediterranean Grand Prix at Enna-Pegusa was next, the first race back after a summer break, during which Alesi, Bernard and Donnelly had all made their F1 debuts at Paul Ricard. The race saw the F3000 debut of Damon Hill, who'd been hired by the Japanese footwork team to replace Ukio Katayama, who had disappointed in the early rounds. Fresh from their F1 heroics, Jean Alesi took pole and Martin Donnelly the fastest lap, but it was Andrea Chiesa who took the win, leading home Italian Claudio Langes of the one-car Forti Corse team, taking their first championship points. Eddie Irvine scored Pacific's first F3000 podium, followed by Apicella, Gary Evans, Danielsson's teammate at Madgwick, fifth, and those were actually the only 5 cars to finish after a real demolition derby of a race. Back to the UK next for a double header, beginning at Brands Hatch, where the French Dams team looked good, with Eric Comas on pole and Bernard with fastest lap, but it was Martin Donnelly on the top step with a win, his first point in an unlucky season, with teammate and championship leader Alesi second in a 1-2 for Eddie Jordan's team. Comas and Bernard came in 3rd and 4th, with convicted child sex offender Gary Brabham 5th and Langer 6th. A week later, on August bank holiday, while the F1 boys were in Spa, it was the Birmingham Super Prix. Eddie Jordan's boys were favourites again, and it was indeed a lazy across the board, winning from pole with fastest lap along the way, while teammate Donnelly, driving a hastily patched up Reynard after a practice shunt, came in 3rd, the two EJR cars backing the consistent Marco Apicella in 2nd place. Eric Bernard took 4th for Dams with Mark Blundell 5th, Eddie Irvine 6th, and locally born Phil Andrews, the first Brummie to drive in the Birmingham Super Prix, yet to score a point this year and just missing out in 7th. As the season came towards its sharp end, the teams followed the F1 circus to Spa next, with Alesi having driven for Tyrrell at Monza in between. A wet race saw Comas on pole, but Alesi took the lead early on and never relinquished it, taking a win to put one hand on the trophy, with Comas 2nd and Apicella 3rd. Eric van der Poel returned to the points after an indifferent mid-season in 4th, with JJ Leto 5th and Danielson scoring his first points in Pau in 6th. The permanent Bugatti circuit at Le Mans hosted the decisive round, with Eric Bernard taking pole, but Dam's teammate and title challenger Comas took the lead from the start and never looked back, taking his first F3000 win from an impressive Eric van der Poel, with Bernard 3rd, Eddie Irvine 4th and Canadian Stefan Prix, van der Poel's teammate, 5th. But in 6th place and taking the single point that was all he needed was Jean Alesi, the 1989 F3000 champion, with one race to go. That race was at Dijon-Prenois, and Alesi opted to skip it in order to race for Tyrrell at the Japanese Grand Prix, which meant that Comas had a chance to tie the season on points even if Alesi had won on the number of wins. Alesi's place was taken by Swede Rickard Riddell, and a few other F3 drivers were given run out by teams short on cash. Alan McNish replaced Leto at Pacific, Andrew Gilbert-Scott took over Jacques Goudchaux's GA March, and Italian Alessandro Zanardi became the 3rd driver for the Italian BVM team. The Dams team took a popular home 1-2, with Comas taking the win to finish the season level with Alesi on points, and Bernard 3rd overall thanks to Marco Apicella retiring from the last 2 races. Andrew Gilbert-Scott took 3rd place in his F3000 debut, with Eddie Irvine, Eric van der Poel and Mark Blundell taking the rest of the points places. Of the other new kids, McNish was 8th and Zanardi 16th. One big event left, the season-ending Macau Grand Prix, with a 32-car field, run to Formula 3 regulations but drawing in drivers from various junior formulae, with many of the emerging talents in F3 and F3000 making the trip to the prestigious event. From British F3, David Brabham, Derek Higgins, Alan McNish, Mika Hakkinen, Paul Stewart, Otto Rensing and Antonio Simões. From Italy, Gianni Morbidelli, Domenico Schiattarella, Antonio Tamburini. From France, champion Jean-Marc Gounon, Eric Ellery, Christophe Bouchou and Laurent Domé, and from Germany, Michaels, Schumacher and Bartels, Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Karl Wendlinger. In the event, and for reasons I haven't been able to determine, 3 of the top 4 drivers in qualifying for the first of the 2 heats, Rickard Riddell in the sole Eddie Jordan car and McNish and Irvine in the 2 West Surrey cars, all withdrew before the race, as did fellow Swede Jan Nilsson driving for the Swedish Giessen team. That left Otto Rensing on pole, but it was Michael Schumacher's WTS Reynard Volkswagen that led David Brabham's Bowman Rault home. Rensing took pole on his own merit for Heat 2 but would fail to finish, as did Schumacher, and David Brabham won the second heat and the event overall, with 1988 Tyrrell F1 driver Julian Bailey 2nd overall and Christophe Bouchou 3rd. So Jack Brabham's family name seemed in good hands for the future, even if his namesake team in Formula 1 was having a bit of a rough patch, and there was plenty of new talent making its way through, which we can look forward to seeing in Formula 1 during the 1990s.